The Fillmore East was suffocating that night. July 15th, 1969. New York City drowning in summer heat and something electric in the air that had nothing to do with the amplifiers. 3,000 people packed into a venue designed for 2,000. Bodies pressed against bodies, sweat mixing with anticipation and the thick marijuana smoke that made everything look dreamlike. The walls themselves seemed to sweat, condensation running down the brick in slow rivers. The air conditioning had died 2 hours before showtime. Management kept promising it would be fixed, but by 9 o'clock the venue felt like a sauna with attitude. People were fanning themselves with concert programs, sharing water bottles like communion wine. The heat was so intense that even breathing felt like work. But nobody was leaving. This was Jimi Hendrix at the Fillmore East. People would have stayed if the building was on fire. Jimmy had already been on stage for 45 minutes, working through Red House and Hey Joe, building that hypnotic groove that made time disappear. His white Stratocaster gleamed under the stage lights, catching every movement of his long, careful fingers. He was wearing a red silk shirt that clung to his skin in the humidity. But now he was transitioning into Little Wing, and the entire atmosphere shifted. This wasn't a song you screamed along to. This was a song that demanded intimacy in a room built for chaos. The opening notes floated above the crowd like whispered prayers, making 3,000 people hold their breath without realizing they were doing it. She was standing in the third row, center section, maybe 20 years old, with long auburn hair that caught the stage lights. Beautiful in that effortless way that made other women glance at her with admiration, then look away. She wore a simple white cotton dress that was now clinging to her skin in the humid air. But tonight, something was fundamentally wrong. The security guard closest to her section noticed first. Mike Torres, 38 years old, ex-Marine with 2 tours in Vietnam behind him. Big guy, 6'3", hired specifically because the Fillmore attracted every kind of chaos imaginable. He'd seen overdoses and knife fights and people who lost their minds to bad acid in the middle of guitar solos. But he'd never seen someone cry the way this girl in the white dress was crying during Little Wing. Not the happy tears of a fan seeing their hero, not the emotional release of someone moved by music. These were different, deeper. Silent sobs that shook her entire frame. Her mascara had run in black streaks down her cheeks, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She wasn't crying at the music. She was crying through it, like the song was pulling something out of her that had been buried too deep for too long. Like something inside her was breaking in real time, piece by piece, with every note Jimmy played. The woman standing next to her noticed too. Middle-aged, wearing tie-dye, tried to comfort her, offered tissues, asked if she was okay. The girl just shook her head, never taking her eyes off Jimmy. Her hands gripped the metal barrier so tight her knuckles went white. Mike moved a step closer, his security instincts telling him to pay attention. People who looked that desperate sometimes did unpredictable things. On stage, Jimmy played with his eyes closed, lost in that meditative space where the best musicians live during their best songs. His face was peaceful, almost religious in its concentration. The Stratocaster seemed to breathe with him, every note perfectly placed. This wasn't showmanship. This was conversation between a man and his instrument, private despite happening in front of 3,000 people. The guitar sang those impossible bends, notes that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. Jimmy's hands moved with the delicacy of a painter, adding final touches to a masterpiece. Every sound was intentional, loaded with emotion that bypassed the brain and went straight to whatever part of humans recognizes beauty. Then he opened his eyes. His gaze swept across the crowd, checking the room's energy, making sure the connection was still solid. But when his eyes reached the third row, center section, they stopped. He saw her immediately. 20-year-old girl in a white dress, crying like her world was ending. For just a moment, his fingers hesitated on the fretboard. A micro pause that lasted maybe half a second, but felt like eternity to anyone really listening. The girl saw that hesitation, saw him seeing her, saw him registering her tears, her desperation. And something inside her snapped. She moved before anyone could react. One moment she was behind the barrier, the next she was climbing over it, pushing through the first 2 rows, heading straight for the stage with single-minded determination. "Security!" someone shouted. Mike Torres was already in motion, his Marine training kicking in. Fans rushing the stage were dangerous for everyone. They could hurt themselves, hurt the performer, start riots. His job was to stop them before they reached the stage, period. But she wasn't running like a typical stage rusher. No screaming, no wild gestures. She moved with purpose, with desperation, like someone running toward their last hope of salvation. "Get her!" voices demanded. "Stop her before she ruins it!" Mike reached the stage edge just as she grabbed it with both hands. His hand was already reaching for her shoulder when Jimmy did something completely unexpected. He stopped playing. Not gradually, not like a song reaching its conclusion. Mid-note, mid-phrase, the Stratocaster went completely silent. 3,000 people who'd been lost in Little Wing suddenly found themselves in absolute quiet. The kind of silence that makes ears ring and hearts skip beats. Jimmy looked down at Mike, then at the girl hanging from the stage edge. He didn't say anything, didn't gesture or give any signal. He just looked with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through people. Mike understood immediately. Later, decades later, he'd tell interviewers he'd never seen eyes like that. Not pleading, he'd say, not commanding, just aware. Like he could see something the rest of us couldn't, understand something we didn't understand. Mike stepped back. The girl pulled herself onto the stage, her white dress catching on the edge. The crowd held its collective breath. This wasn't supposed to happen. Concert protocol was clear. Stage rushers got removed, fast and hard, no matter who they were. But Jimmy had set his guitar aside, was walking toward her with slow, careful steps. Like approaching a wounded animal that might run if he moved too quickly. The stage lights caught the sequins on his shirt, making him shimmer, but his face was completely human, focused on this one person who'd needed him badly enough to risk everything. She stood there in the full glare of stage lights, suddenly aware that 3,000 people were staring at her. The tears were still coming, but differently now. Quieter, more vulnerable, like someone who just realized they were completely exposed. "Hey," Jimmy said, his voice barely audible but somehow intimate enough that the stage microphones carried it to every corner. One word, soft as cotton, gentle as someone talking to a frightened child. She looked at him, really looked at him, not at Jimi Hendrix the rock star, but at James Marshall Hendrix, the human being. The man who'd stopped his show because someone was hurting. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know why I shouldn't have." "It's okay," he said. And then he did something that changed 3,000 lives in 30 seconds. He opened his arms. Not dramatically, not like a performer playing to the crowd, like someone offering comfort to another human being who needed it. Like someone who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is let another person know they're not alone. She hesitated for maybe half a heartbeat, trying to understand if this was real. Then she stepped forward and Jimi Hendrix wrapped his arms around a complete stranger in front of 3,000 witnesses. The embrace lasted exactly 32 seconds. Security timed it later. But those seconds felt infinite to everyone watching. Time stretched and seemed to stop completely, like the universe had decided this moment was too important to rush through. She cried into his shoulder, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than sadness. Not desperate tears, but something that sounded like relief, like someone who'd been holding her breath for months finally being allowed to exhale. Her white dress was soaked with sweat and tears, but neither of them cared. She smelled like summer rain, and fear and hope all mixed together. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, rapid at first, then gradually slowing as the embrace continued. Nothing existed except this moment, this person who'd seen her pain and responded with kindness instead of judgment. The heat of the venue, the 3,000 people watching, the pressure of being on stage, all of it disappeared. There was only this. Two human beings recognizing something essential in each other. The crowd didn't make a sound. 3,000 people watched two strangers share a moment of perfect human connection, and everybody understood instinctively that they were witnessing something sacred. The woman in the third row who'd offered tissues was crying now. The bartender stood frozen with beer halfway to a customer, tears streaming down his face. The photographer lowered his camera and just watched, understanding some moments are too beautiful to capture. Even Mike Torres felt something shift in his chest, something breaking open that he'd kept closed since Vietnam. Later, he'd tell his wife it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever witnessed. Jimmy whispered something in the girl's ear, something nobody else could hear. She whispered something back. Then slowly, gently, she pulled away from him. "Thank you," she said, loud enough for the microphones to catch. "Thank you," he replied, and the way he said it made clear she'd given him something too. She walked to the stage edge. Mike stepped forward to help her down, not roughly like protocol demanded, but carefully like she was made of glass. Someone in the crowd immediately made room for her. She found a place to stand among strangers who'd become witnesses, and something had changed in her posture, in her breathing. The desperate tension that had gripped her during the first part of the show was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. The people around her were different too. The tie-dyed woman who'd offered tissues reached out and gently touched her arm, not speaking, just acknowledging what they had all seen. A bearded man in a denim jacket nodded at her with the kind of respect usually reserved for war veterans. These weren't strangers anymore. They were a congregation that had witnessed something sacred together. Jimmy walked back to his microphone, picked up his Stratocaster, adjusted the strap with those fingers that had just held a stranger while she cried. He tested the tuning, then looked out at the crowd, still processing what they'd seen. "Little Wing," he said into the microphone, and started the song over from the beginning. But it was completely different now. The same notes, same melody, but everything had changed. The guitar didn't just sing anymore. It spoke about loneliness and connection, and the moment when strangers recognize something essential in each other, about courage to ask for help and grace to give it. Every note had more weight, more purpose. The bends were deeper, more emotional. Jimmy played like someone who'd just remembered why he'd picked up a guitar in the first place, why he'd devoted his life to turning electricity and wood into something that could reach inside souls. The crowd listened differently too, more carefully, more gratefully, like they'd all been reminded that music wasn't just entertainment, it was communication at its most essential level. It was healing. When the song ended, the applause was unlike anything the Fillmore had ever heard. Not wild, not screaming, reverent, grateful, like a church congregation saying amen after hearing something that changed their understanding of prayer. The rest of the show was electric in a different way. Jimmy played for 2 more hours, through Purple Haze and Hey Joe and Red House, and every song felt like a gift. Not from a rock star to fans, but from one human being to others who needed to remember that someone understood what it felt like to hurt. Nobody talked about the girl during the show. She became part of the community that night, protected by collective understanding that something sacred had happened. After the show, she disappeared, slipped out with the crowd, vanished into New York City night. Mike looked for her, wanted to check if she was okay, but she was gone, leaving only the memory of 32 seconds that changed 3,000 lives. For years, nobody knew her name or story. She became legend without identity. The girl from the Fillmore show. Musicians who were there told the story to other musicians. Details stayed consistent because everyone understood they'd seen something important. In 1994, 25 years later, a Rolling Stone journalist tracked her down. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She was married, living in Portland, working as a high school English teacher. When asked about that night, she was quiet for a long time. "I'd lost my brother in Vietnam 3 weeks earlier," she finally said. "Bobby, he was 19, just a kid really, but he was the one who'd introduced me to Jimmy's music." We listened to Are You Experienced over and over in his room. When he got drafted, the last thing he said was, "Keep listening to Jimmy. He understands things other people don't understand." She paused, staring out her kitchen window. "I went to that show because I didn't know what else to do with grief. I'd been walking around for 3 weeks feeling like I was drowning. I bought the ticket the day I got the telegram about Bobby. I certainly didn't plan to run on stage." The journalist asked what made her break at that moment. "When Jimmy looked at me during Little Wing, really looked at me, I saw something I hadn't seen since Bobby died. I saw someone who understood that music isn't separate from pain. It's what you do with pain when you can't do anything else. It's how you turn something that's killing you into something that might save someone else." The journalist asked if she'd ever tried to contact Hendrix after that night. I wrote him letters, she said. Dozens. Never sent one. What do you say to someone who saved your life with a hug? How do you thank someone for showing 3,000 strangers that kindness isn't weakness? When Hendrix died in September 1970, Sarah cried for 3 days, not just for him, but for everyone who would never experience that kind of grace in person. People remember Jimmy for his guitar playing, she said, and they should. He was magic with that instrument. But that night taught me something different. He was magic with people too. He understood that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is stop performing and just be human. Mike Torres, the security guard who'd stepped back when Jimmy looked at him, kept working concerts for 30 more years. He saw every major rock star of the 70s and 80s. But he never saw anything like July 15th, 1969. That girl running on stage changed something fundamental in me, he said in a 2003 interview. Made me understand my job wasn't just about keeping order. It was about protecting something precious, the connection between artists and audiences, the moment when music becomes more than music. The story became part of Hendrix mythology, but unlike most rock legends, this one made people better. Musicians who heard it treated audiences differently. Security guards showed more compassion. Fans understood concerts could be community, not just consumption. That night at the Fillmore East, Jimi Hendrix stopped being just a guitar god and became something more important. He became a reminder that behind all the volume and effects and revolutionary sounds, rock and roll was fundamentally about one person reaching another person and saying, "You're not alone. I see you. Your pain matters." And sometimes if you're paying attention, if you're open to it, that reaching happens in front of 3,000 witnesses and changes everything for everyone who sees it.